Hi, this is Harry Guinness for Make Use Of, and in this article, I'm going to show you how to make this spooky picture. You can see there's a photo of me standing in a graveyard, and there's also these three ghostly figures that appear to be haunting it. So we're going to look in this screencast at the Photoshop process for this. I talk a bit about how I shot this in the accompanying written post. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import the images that I'm going to be using for this Photoshop tutorial. So I'm going to go File and then Scripts and then Load Files into Stack. Then I'm going to navigate to where I have these images, and if you download the resources pack, you'll get them too. So we've got Spooky Graveyard 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I'm just going to select all four of them, click Open, and then I'll get this dialog box here, and I want to click Attempt to automatically align source images. I shot these with a camera on a tripod, and it's an Olympus OM5, I think, which is a $500 mirrorless camera that I'm reviewing for Make Use Of at the moment. So it's a very, very affordable camera. This isn't anything professional. You could also do the same with your iPhone, but the problem is the tripod I was using was a GorillaPod sitting on a hedge, so there was no real guarantee of perfect alignment between shots. So if you don't leave that checked, you're never going to be sure whether the images align perfectly, and you want them to do that. Now Photoshop's gone in and it's aligned the images, and it seems to have done a very good job of that. You know, if you look at where the cross is here, and I turn this off and on, you can see only the clouds in the background and the subjects of the photos move. So now I want to position the layers so that we've got them in the order I want to work with. So this picture on top is going to be the base plate. This is the one that's going to be making up most of the image. So I'm going to drag that to the bottom, and then I'm going to take the other three layers, going to shift click on the top one, and then press Command G or Control G if you're on a PC to group them together. And then I'm going to title that layer, or that group rather, Spooks. And that way I can just turn them all off at once or turn them back on. Next, we can see this little border around, which is where the images aren't aligned perfectly. So some of them are extending a little bit more in one way or the other. So I'm going to grab the crop tool with C, and then I'm going to make sure that original ratio is checked. And then I'm just going to drag in from the edges just to get rid of that border. And yep, that looks pretty good. Push return or enter to accept that, and that just means that we're not going to have any weird border on the image. Next, it's time to start blending the spooks into the image, and this is really simple. Because I've shot this with the camera in the same position and using the same exposure, it means that blending them in is a simple matter of just masking in the bits we want. Only one of the spooks overlaps with our main frame, so you can see that my shoulder there. Only the spook here, his leg, overlaps a little bit, so we'll address that last. But for the others, it's a very simple process to mask them in. And I can see that we've got this little bit of white here at the bottom, so I'm just going to grab the crop tool again and then just drag up a little bit just to get rid of that. We don't want that showing up at all. Not too fussed about losing a little bit over here. Okay, so we're going to start with Graveyard 5. I'm going to turn it on, and we've got the spooky figure over on the left, and I'm going to click on the 5 graveyard layer, and then I'm going to hold down Option or Alt as I click on the Add Layer Mask button. And this is going to add a layer mask and fill it with black. If you watched the first screencast in this series where I made the spooky skull face, you're going to be very familiar with masks. And basically what happens is if I paint on them white, it's going to reveal things. If I paint on with black, it's going to hide them. You can see the layer mask is filled with black, so everything's totally hidden. Now if I grab the brush tool with the B key and select the layer mask, and then I want to paint with an opacity about 100% and a flow at 20%, a nice round soft brush, and I know the figure's over here, so I'm just going to make my brush a little bit bigger, and then I'm just going to start painting and gradually bring this figure into the image. Now, if you wanted to have them ghostly so that you couldn't see their legs or some such, you could easily do that just by painting in different sections. So that's the first phantom introduced. Now, unfortunately, this is a phantom dressed in quite a nice polo hoodie, which is not something we want. So I'm going to select the phantom layer, not the layer mask, and then I'm going to grab the healing brush tool. So it's the one with the band-aid. And I want the spot healing brush tool. So you can see that if I click on this and hold down, we get a few options for a healing brush tool. We want the spot healing brush tool. It's going to be the simplest one to use, and it's just going to work perfectly for this. So then I'm going to press Command 1, Control 1 if you're on a PC, to zoom in to 100% so we can get a closer look at the pixels we're working on. With the healing brush tool, you just paint over an area that you want to get rid of. So whether it's a spot or a blemish, or in this case a logo and this white tie, then it just looks at the pixels that are in the surrounding area and does some algorithmic magic to decide what to get rid of. So starting with the red pony here, I'm just going to paint over like this, and gone. You can see there's a little bit of loss of texture and stuff like that, but at the resolution we're going to be exporting this out at, it's nothing I'm too concerned with. If this was for a fashion shoot and it had to be perfect, then we'd use other tools and techniques, but for something like this, where we're going to be doing a lot of effects over the top, it's really not going to make a difference. Same thing for this white necktie sort of thing. I don't know what we call these tassels that you are meant to use for tightening a hoodie, but really just sort of sit there and do nothing but just paint over it and then release. And then Photoshop's done a terrible job of guessing what needs to be done there. It's going to push Command Z, and we're going to try that again, and maybe just do a little bit at the bottom and then again at the top. You can always undo your work and go back over and blend them in. So when I was doing this first time around, it worked perfectly for me, but it's not doing it. There we go. That's starting to look a little better. If I just zoom out, so Command 0, you can see that over there it really is fairly unnoticeable. There's a little bit of weirdness there around the edge that you might just take care of by painting over one more time, and that's just making things worse for some reason. So I'm going to undo that one more time, and yeah, you know what, I'm actually just going to leave that as is. You really don't need to be too exact with something like that in this image. You know, from 100%, we're going to be fading these ghosts. You don't have to be perfect. There's lots of times with Photoshop that you need to spend some time on things and really make them perfect, but to be honest, this just isn't one of them. Next, we're going to do this for the foregraveyard layer. So I'm going to turn the layer on, select it, and then I'm going to hold down Option and click on the Add Layer Mask button to add the layer mask filled with black. Now he's situated over here, so I'm going to grab the brush, make it a little bit smaller, because I've got to be careful that the feathering doesn't come in and affect the mask of the other guy. So he's over there, perfect, coming back into focus. And yep, now if my brush is too big and I do this, you'll see that the other mask starts to be affected because we start to introduce the trees and stuff over the top of that. Switch the color of my masks back to black using the X key, which switches the two swatches there, and then just paint away that. Make the brush a bit smaller because I've accidentally affected there, and then just paint in the rest of that effect. That looks perfect. Again, we got the same problem with the two tassels there. So I'm going to select the layer, not the layer mask, jump into 100%, move around. I'm using the move tool, or the hand tool rather, to move around. And to get to that quickly, I'm just holding down the space bar, and then you're able to just drag around with your cursor. Press J, which is the shortcut for the spot healing brush, and then just paint over the tassels like that. And this time they're vanishing a little easier. And then again for the other one, we'll see how it affects the zipper. We might need to redo that, but no, that looks pretty good. It's not pulling in too much of the zipper. Brilliant. If you want to get rid of that zipper, you can as well. So zoom back out, and that looks pretty good. That's 2 spooks introduced. Next, we're going to turn on this third one, and I'm going to select the layer, and I'm going to lower its opacity down to 50%. And you can see that we've got this merging effect here where my shoulder and this spooks, which is also me, leg, interact. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the pen tool to create a really nice edge here that we're going to be able to work with. So I'm going to add the layer mask to that layer. Same technique, hold down Option, select that. And I know exactly where this is. This is my right shoulder. So I'm going to grab the pen tool with the P key. Now we have a full article on the pen tool on Make Use Of. So I'm just going to touch on what it does briefly. But the pen tool is one of the most powerful selection tools in Photoshop. It allows you to create the hardest edges and to really trace an object. If I was to cut myself out of this because I wanted to change the background or something like that, I'd trace around myself with the pen tool. Now, the pen tool works using Bezier Curves. So I click here to create an anchor point, and then I drag in the direction that I want the curve to go. If I want to move that anchor point around, I can hold down the spacebar key and I can adjust it to there. So I want to start that anchor point about there. And then when I want another anchor point, I click and drag. And you can see it's creating this curve between the 2 anchor points. And somewhere around there looks pretty good. And then again, I'm going to click up here. And we're going to add a third anchor point that looks something like that. And then click, 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 click. And then click to finish this. So now we've just selected out this area with the pen tool, which has created a path. And a path is something there's a panel for in Photoshop. If you're doing a lot of design work, you'll become very familiar with it. But we don't really need to dive into that now today. So with this path, I need to make a selection because then I can use it in creating this mask. So up here when it says next to path, we've got make selection. Click on that and we're going to get this dialog box. And I want to feather this by about 2 pixels. This image is sharp, but it's not perfectly sharp. If you look at any of the edges here, there's little bits of blurring and stuff like that. So about 2 pixels is probably going to be perfect. And click OK. And that's converted into this selection. Now if I grab the brush tool and we've got the mask selected, if I paint white over here, nothing happens. If I paint inside the selection, we get this effect. So I'm going to do that. So basically only things that are inside the selection are affected. That's not what we want because we want to paint outside the selection. So we're going to inverse the selection. Now the keyboard shortcut to do that is Shift Command I or Shift Control I on a PC. Now you saw the selection moved a little bit there. Now when I paint white out here, we're going to start to introduce this phantom. But when I paint close to the edge here, we're not losing any of the effect on my my shoulder. Now the layer opacity is at 53%, so I'm just going to bring that up to 100% again so that we're really painting it back in. There we go. And drag around and then just paint in. I got to be careful because this bit isn't masked out, for example, so we'll have to fix that again in a second. The only bits saved by the selection are the bits that are actually masked out, but you can see we've got this really nice edge there, and we'll take a closer look at that in a second. Make the brush a bit smaller, come down here, then swap to black and fix this bit here. Now if I want to take a look at what's behind the selection, I can push Command or Control H to hide the selection, and that just hides the marching ants. The selection's still there, but they're just hidden, and that looks pretty good. But there's one thing I can do to improve it slightly. If I hold Shift Command I again, it's going to inverse that selection. Now I'm painting with black, so I'm just going to paint black on the inside of this selection edge. And this just is going to blend things back so that we're really bringing in the nice edge here. Press Command H, and you can see that that blends really naturally there. Just bring that. Okay, I don't like how that's doing there. I want to blend the leg in here. So swap the selection again, and then Command H, and then painting with white. So X to swap. Just bring that back in there. So you're always going to be going back and forth with these things, working out which bit and which side of the mask you want to be working on that's going to give you the best edge. Zoom back out, Command Z, and you can see that that edge looks great. It looks like I'm standing behind myself. If you just casually glance at this photo, you really can't tell there's much of an effect. Now obviously if you go in and pixel peep, you'll start to notice things, and these are the kind of things that the more time you spend doing them, the better you get, and also the more time you actually spend doing it with each photo, the better the edges will be. You know, if you're doing a composition for an advertising campaign or something like this, you will spend hours working on a single mask like this to make sure that it's perfect. Again, clicking on the actual photo, pressing J to grab the healing brush tool, zooming in to 100%, and then painting away the branding there. And again, for these white tassels, just over the top, and boom, gone. Just fixing up the little edges if you got any issues like that. And again, over that. And that's perfect. Zoom out to fill with Command or Control 0, and we can see we've got these 3 spooks added in behind me, looking terrifying. Now, looking at this from afar, there's one thing I noticed. There's these little splodges over here on the base plate. I'm going to click on the base plate there. Command 1, zoom in. These are just small distractions that, while I'm here with the healing brush open, I'm just going to get rid of them. And you can see this is really where Photoshop comes into its own. Getting rid of small little blemishes like that is a matter of seconds. Zoom back out, and that's beginning to take shape. Now obviously this looks weird. It's just me standing in a graveyard with 3 of me dressed in black hoodies. So we need to start and really make this a spooky image. So the first thing I'm going to do is let's turn these spooks into ghosts. Now there's a few ways I could actually do this. I could play around with blending modes like well, multiply because they're black. Ooh, that's not having much of an interesting effect. Well, perhaps screen. That's again, we're getting some weird effects from the layer masks. Something like overlay or soft light might be, if you had a good mask for these. It's always interesting to play around with blending modes, but that's not the way I'm going to do it. So we're going to go back to normal. Instead, I'm just going to reduce the opacity down to whatever level I want. Somewhere in the 20s or 30s is going to give the most subtle ghostly effect. If you go down too low, you know, to 4, 5, 6%, you really just won't see them. You know, there's no recognizable features there. They just look like splodges. Whereas if you go up to 100% or, you know, 80%, then you don't get that ghostly effect. You don't see things behind them. So somewhere in the around 30% is going to give the best effect for these. So that's the ghosts and spooks ready. Next, we want to pull everything together. We need to work on the image as a whole, working on the color levels. We're going to convert it to black and white, then we're going to add some sepia to it. I also want to do a little bit of dodging and burning to the image. So I'm just going to grab a curves layer, and I'm going to drag that to the outside of the group because I want it affecting everything. And then I'm just going to drag up in this curves layer on the midtones, maybe drag down those highlights a bit because I don't want them being brightened up to something that I'm a little bit happier with. So yeah, turn that off and on. And I'm not too fussed about the colors in the image because, as I said, we're going to convert this to black and white, which we'll actually do right now. Last time I did this a little later, but there's no reason not to do it now. So click on the black and white adjustment layer, and then we get the default. And this is what Photoshop's doing for its best guess black and white. And to be honest, that looks pretty good. You can click on the preset and then change, so we could see what a blue filter would look like, and that has some very interesting effects on my blue jumper, you know, green filter, and again, really affects the grass and things like that. But I think the default value works really well. I might play around. No, there's really no need to play around with the sliders. I'm happy with how this looks, and we're going to be pulling it over to Sepia. If you want to dig in and play around with the sliders and adjust things, you know, if you've got a particular color you want to darken or brighten, then you can do it with the sliders there. But for this image, there's really no need. So next, we're going to dodge and burn a few bits. So I'm going to hold down Command-Shift-N to create a new layer, push Return to accept that, and then I'm going to change this to a soft light layer. Grab the brush tool, and we want to be painting with opacity of 100% and a flow of around 20%. So I'm going to set that by holding down Shift and pushing on 2. Now for the opacity of the layer itself, 100% is going to be too much. So somewhere around 30-35 is where we want to be. So looking at my swatches, push D to make sure that they are black and white. Black's going to darken things, white is going to brighten them. This is a technique I again used in the first video of the series. So looking around, what are the areas of this image I want to darken and brighten? Well, the first thing I want to do is brighten up my face in the foreground here. So I'm going to make the brush a little bit bigger and then just paint a little bit of white in there. And that's just going to make this more of a focal point, maybe a little bit more on the eyes like that, so that you're first drawn to me here, and only then do you notice the figures in the background. By the same token, I'm just going to brighten up the face on each of these spooky figures, and maybe the hands, just the skin areas, just like this, to pull a little bit of focus to them. And that looks good. And then I'm going to swap to black, and I want to just darken up some of these gravestones so that we really notice them, make them look a bit grimier, grittier. Again, this one we'll do the same for, so that they're going to have a bit more visual weight in the background of the image. You always want this sort of contrast between things, and having these as some of the darker elements is going to add a lot more weight to them. So turn this off and on, and yeah, I think that's having an interesting effect in the image. I'm also going to add a little bit of a vignette, so I'm going to make this brush a bit bigger and then just paint in some black around the edge like this, and again up here, lower corner, and like that. And that's all just to pull focus over towards me. So off and on, and you can see that's affecting the way you see the image. That's putting a lot more focus over here and less on the background, so they become a lot more subtle. So this image is actually almost done. It's really quite simple if you shoot it properly to add extra ghosts and things into a Photoshop or into a photo. As long as you make sure that the image is consistent between each one, you can just blend things in really simply. I want to make this sepia though. I think that's a nice archaic look, a little bit nicer than this sort of grey monotone look. So I'm going to create a new layer, Command-Shift-N, and then push Return, and then I'm going to fill it with a sort of brown for sepia. So I'm going to come over here and double click on that swatch, and then I'm going to click on the color picker, and something around here is going to be a sepia color. Click OK. Then I'm going to press Alt Delete on a Mac, or Option Delete on a Mac, Alt Delete on a PC, to fill that layer with the foreground color. And it's done. We've got this lovely brown look. But what we're going to do instead is change the blend mode to overlay. And if this effect is obviously much too strong, so we're going to reduce that just by pulling down the opacity to somewhere in the 20s is normally pretty good for this sort of thing. That just adds the subtle sepia tone a bit higher, and it just starts to look a little bit weird, but the 20s tends to be pretty good. So that's this really almost done. If I was wearing slightly more period-y costumes, I could almost pretend this was an ancestor of mine that took this photo, and these creepy people weren't actually in the background. This was my family plot or something like that. So if you're planning to shoot this yourself, that might be something that's worth doing. The last thing I want to do is really hammer home this film look, and to do that I'm going to add some noise, which is going to replicate the grain you'd get on old film photos. It just means that you can maybe pretend that you scanned in an image you found. So I'm going to create a new layer with Command-Shift-N, then press return, and then I'm going to create a stamp visible layer with the mash your keyboard E shortcut, which is Command-Option-Shift-E, Control-Alt-Shift-E on a PC. And you can see it's created this layer that has all our effects on it. Then I'm going to go to filter and noise and add noise. Now we want the distribution to be Gaussian, you don't want it to be uniform, and you definitely want it to be monochromatic. If I turn that off, you can see that we get all this color noise. If I increase the amount, you'll see it more, so we get this horrible color noise. If I make it uniform, it becomes a regular pattern and it's really awful. So you want it Gaussian, you want it monochromatic, and you do not want 164%. You want about 2%, somewhere less than 5. The more zoomed in you are, 4.8% is a little bit too much, somewhere around 3. You can see with this, if I click and then let go, we get a preview. This is quite subtle, so you may or may not be able to see this in the YouTube video. It depends on the resolution you're looking at. But I'm going to click OK to accept that, and then I'm going to zoom in to 100%, come over, look at my face, and I'm going to turn this off and on, which should give you the best chance of seeing the effect that it has. So it just adds in this little noise effect that really makes the image look like it's lower quality in a scan. Zoom back out, and this is the final image. We've got these 3 ghostly figures in the background. We've got me standing in a graveyard, and as I said, if I was wearing something more appropriate and not a hoodie, I could pretend that this was my ancestor and he'd taken the photo in the 50s or 60s and that these were the ghostly figures. So for more on how I actually shot this and a little bit more information and links to some useful resources, check out the written post that accompanies this screencast. I'm Harry Guinness, and this was an article for Make Use Of.